everyone. I'd like to just thank AGSA really quickly for selecting my paper for today's conference. I'm really excited to be here amongst all of you amazing researchers and thinkers. So my name is Katrina, and I'm going to be presenting my paper called Reclaiming Body Territory in the City, Spatial Violence Activist Networks. So, there is a long history of activism and mobilization, especially women's activism, in Point St. Charles, or The Point, a neighborhood in the sud-west of Montreal. This was the site for the Right to the City, a class led by Dr. Cynthia Hammond, part of an innovation grant funded by Concordia University in September 2014. The class comprised of three groups of classes from art history, and theater, and we came together to work in this space, share the warmth in the Point. The work in our art history seminar culminated in artistic interventions all over the Point in order to create alternative forms of research and creation. So my talk today is going to situate my own intervention, which started in an underpass walkway on Wellington Street under the Canadian National Railway tracks, and the intervention concluded at a women's organization in the Point called Madame Prend Congé, or in English, Madame Takes a Break. In the intervention, I discussed how women have reclaimed and are still in the process of reclaiming their bodies within the city through the fight for safer spaces and activism against violence. For this presentation, I will discuss the intervention within the spatial context of the Point as a means to look at activist networks against gendered violence. And rather than allowing for bodies to be claimed, these spatial circumstances are conditions for social activism and mobilization to take place, such as the creation of community centers and groups and organized grassroots movements. Today we will be looking at the creation of networks of activism against aggression and violence, or how to reclaim our body territory. So I was in the mapping workshop this morning, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of the things that we were talking about in the mapping workshop really related to my project. So the next little thing I'm going to say was just really present for me when I was in this workshop this morning, so thanks Nicola for that. Taking photographs has always been a deliberate experience through my city explorations. It is in the act of stopping mid-walk where I spend time with my surrounding details. Through these moments, I often feel what Jane Bennett calls the wonder in minor experiences, the enchantment of public place. It is during one of these encounters that I came across the underpass at Wellington. I found myself in a more industrial part of town. North and east of Wellington is a shipment yard, and Wellington is a busy street with passing traffic. Given that it is so close to the moving traffic as well as the railway and movement from other pedestrians, poorly lit even in the daytime, it is not what one would categorize as a safe space. This underpass, with its history under the train tracks and the location on Wellington Street, one of the main streets of the Point and the same street where Shed of Warmth was located, became the beginning site for my intervention. So previously, I had engaged in another site-specific intervention in a similar concrete place, a fire escape stairwell in this building. This intervention was part of another class led by Dr. Hammond, and within the stairwell, I created a women's safety audit to question the safety of that space, and asking whether such spaces can actually be conducive to the movement of women rather than destructive and oppressive. 1 in 4 students will experience some sort of sexual assault during their post-secondary career. So I asked, can we prevent violence in public space by effecting changes to those spaces? A women's safety audit tool has been used by UN Habitat and also groups such as Women in Cities. So this previous intervention was, for me, the starting point for the second intervention that I did this past fall. During my research on the Point, I began to find newspaper articles about young women from the Point who had gone missing and were murdered, particularly the cases of Sharon Pryor, Tammy Leakey, and Jolene Riando. In 1975, at the age of 16, Sharon Pryor went missing near her home on Rue Congrégation. And 6 years later, only a few blocks away, Tammy Leakey went missing at the age of 12. And more recently, in 1999, Jolene Riando went missing at the age of 10. So with all of these cases in mind, I continue to think about notions of safety in space and how I could access an intervention that would be both informative but also talking about these cases with care. Through these stories of missing young women, I saw something very powerful. The community didn't let their heartbreak, their pain, and outrage go unnoticed. Still today, members of Point St. Charles continue to work on Sharon Pryor's case. A group from the Point recently tried to rename the Parc Congrégation to Parc Sharon Pryor in memory of her. And when Jolene Riando went missing, members from the community reached out to the family to help poster for her. And St. Columba House, a very well-known organization in Des Moines, was also the starting location for the vigil, which occurred 10 years later after her disappearance, when her body had still not been found. Ooh, nerves. All right. So in another case in 2008, Maisie Ojik and Shannon Alexander went missing in Maniwaki, Quebec. And the community, again, didn't stay quiet. The media coverage, because of this, the media coverage was incredibly wide, and the people of Maniwaki continue to have annual vigils for the two girls, as they have still not been found, and have fundraised money for a reward for information on their location. The community has not relented in their activism, and these collective actions and mobilization around these cases of missing and murdered bodies is still even more present today, as public outcry can be disseminated on our social networks. So the disturbing and growing number of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada is well documented by activist groups. Across Canada, people have mobilized for a public inquiry on these cases, as seen in most recently with Renelle Harper when she was left dead near Winnipeg. People continue to mobilize around these cases, though the federal government has yet to agree to launch a public inquiry. Teresa Villeneuve, the chair of the Assembly for First Nation Women's Council, has critiqued this movement, quote, "Nobody takes it seriously until a tragedy happens, and then all of a sudden people wake up to the problem," end quote. While I agree with Teresa and that we shouldn't just be paying attention to this when a tragedy occurs, I do think that this kind of activism is one of the most productive ways that we can reclaim these instances of violence and work to produce something meaningful in our communities and at higher levels. It is for these reasons that the annual marches for missing and murdered Indigenous women across the country which happened recently on February 14th, why they are so important. Take Back the Night, another example of this kind of activism, is an annual march that happens internationally. This year in Montreal, Take Back the Night was organized by Concordia University's Center for Gender Advocacy on November 21st. The march is part of the center's campaign for a safer Concordia. Quote from their website: "We are marching for a safer community free of harassment, sexual abuse, and assaults for people of all genders. We reclaim our right to be free of violence and to walk without fear any time of day or night," end quote. The evening started with those opening speeches from the community, and then we walked from Guy to McGill University, and it was an incredibly powerful display of solidarity. Around the same time as Take Back the Night, many of you may have, when you were walking around Concordia's downtown campus, may have noticed these "Don't Watch" posters. They are against street harassment and assault. And from their website, the anonymous group writes, "We are taught to live in fear, always threatened with the possibility of being assaulted and never offered any tools to deal with it other than ridiculous advice, such as never walk alone at night, don't wear skirts, and lately don't take a taxi by yourself if you happen to be drunk." That serves to reinforce rape culture and put the onus on the victim. These bilingual posters are available online to print for free, and they send a potent message. We are reclaiming our right to walk in the city without the experience of violence, without fear or danger. So communities have the power to be active networks, and I continue to see this shared resilience in the Point during my research there. The neighborhood has had a long-standing history of community activism and community organizations committed to the creation of solutions for issues related to housing, education, poverty, and safety. For example, in the 60s and 70s, women in the Point started to create safer safer streets for their children and themselves, including a 20-mile-per-hour law, where they just lay down on the road and stopped cars from passing by. Jessica Mills writes, quote, "The pride of the neighborhood, challenging living conditions and awareness of the local elite left the point fertile for activism, which resulted in positive gains for residents," end quote. There are a number of still standing clear examples of these collective actions, such as a community health center, road limits, parks, and the current 557 bus route. An underpass, which you can see here, on Shearer Street, my quote didn't show up. Anyway, an underpass on Shearer Street, like the Wellington Walkway, was eventually closed due to women's activism against space, which had been a place of violence. Right. Faye Wakeling writes, this is the quote you can't really see here, "Without this mobilization, the community would never have been able to keep together, and the effects of poverty would have been even worse." In her dissertation, she discusses with members from St. Columba House how women in the Point needed to be independent and strong, as they were often survivors of poverty and violence. Though, quote, "it takes the support of other women to help you know that it is all right to stand up for what you really believe in," end quote. When one woman from the community was assaulted by a doctor at the local health clinic, 6 women from St. Columba's discussion group went to go speak to the clinic director to create a new policy against this happening again. The women's group started meeting in the mid-1980s once a week, and they have held many conversations on the topic of violence, even inviting the police to discuss how they deal with domestic abuse with the group. Another women's group in the Point is Madame Congé, MPC. This was the final site for my intervention in the fall. MPC was founded in 1979 and offers many services for women, including a daycare, free computers, and a documentation center. They fight against poverty and violence, and they promote women gender equality. They organize weekly activities and also host a weekly discussion group that tackles topics such as gender violence, sexuality, housing, and advocacy. As well, they also organize the annual March Against Women's Poverty. Michelle Comte, the coordinator of MPC, was happy to have our class meet with her. During my intervention, Michelle welcomed us to MPC, showed us her facilities, and discussed the organization and its activities. As well, Micheline introduced us to 2 women who partake in their workshop, and both women told us how their time with the organization has helped them to feel more connected with their own community, as well as feeling more confident in their day-to-day lives. Throughout my research on the Point, the writing of Cease Transkin has been with me. Quote, "For women and girls, to live in our bodies in a male-controlled world is to live in a place of continual siege. I have not wholly concluded the process of reclaiming all the territory that is my body. The reconquering of territory and the maintenance of territory continues daily. Someday, I will fully and unconditionally occupy all of its space at all times." Fran Onkis argues that gender and sexuality are inherently connected to public space, that, quote, "issues of gender and sexuality affect the perception and use of urban spaces," end quote. And Doreen Massey writes that space can, quote, "moment in networks of social relations and understandings," end quote. As a backlash against women's violence and gender inequalities, the feminist activist insurgents in the Point has had lasting effects. In the case of this area in Montreal, women's groups such as St. Columba House and Madame Congé started as grassroots movements but have developed into lasting institutions, growing out of the needs of the community and working towards reclaiming their bodies and these contested spaces. We continue to see that spaces have been reclaimed or can and should be reclaimed, and that public space can be safe for all. As we can see through this presentation, there are tangible strides that the community has made and is still making, and this work in solidarity with this work must persist, because the right to the city is ours. Thank you.